So this is an initial review of my RC10 B5. After I did the build series maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, I didn't have any time to go racing with this. I was a little busy. So the first time I got to race this was yesterday. We had a trophy race at my local racetrack. So literally I showed up in the morning. I got a few practice runs in, not even a full battery pack, like half a pack. And then I had to throw the car down and start qualifying. I was very happy with how it performed, but I'll get into the performance part in a moment. I first want to go over a few things I missed during the build, some small things, but they're kind of important. The manual, for some reason, does not remind you to use thread lock in any part of the build where you're putting metal screws into metal parts. The most obvious one here is the front wheel axle. So you're putting a metal screw into a metal wheel axle. And I had tried to use blue thread lock, and it did not hold. Maybe my blue thread lock has gone bad or something. It's actually kind of old. But I ended up having to settle on using red Loctite, which is sort of the permanent Loctite. So if I ever have to take this out, maybe I just have to buy a new unit. You may be able to deactivate that Loctite with heat. Maybe take a soldering iron tip and put it up against a screw. It heats up the screw, it heats up the Loctite, and may be able to debond it. Very similar to like using a heat gun to take, the tires off the rims. So just bear that in mind. You'll need some kind of thread lock up here, and because I went out for 2 laps and this screw fell out. So just so you know, definitely use thread lock there. On the rear hub carrier is the other part where you might need it. I'm not exactly sure that you will, but one of my friends had a problem with his ball stud popping out. There's an aluminum insert on the back and a plastic insert on the front of the top of the rear hub carrier. So use a little bit of blue thread lock on the back here where the ball stud mounts into the aluminum insert. I would guess that the plastic insert on the front, that actually threads, I'm pretty sure, when you screw the ball stud in. So that should hold the ball stud in place, but maybe it's not a strong enough hold. So just put some thread lock in the back. Okay, so that's that. The electronics installation, at least for the servo, is very simple. One thing I do like about the servo installation is that this link here is a solid piece now. On the B4, it was 2 separate ball cups with a little tie rod or turnbuckle there, so you had to get that length just right to make sure everything was centered. Here it's just one solid piece, so that makes the installation very straightforward. The only thing that would have been helpful, I mean, you can figure it out on your own, but the manual for the B4 build tells you whether or not you need to use spacers between the servo and the servo mount piece, depending on the brand of servo you have. In the B5, they give you those optional spacers, but the manual does not have any sort of a chart or table to tell you, based on this brand or this type of servo, use these spacers. You just have to go in and do a mock fit, fit it with and without the spacers, and just see what gives you the straightest linkage here for whatever spacers you do or don't use. So I'm using a high-tech servo here. This is the HS, I think 7940TH. And with that servo, I ended up using, I think, the thin spacers. Pretty sure. Hard to tell. I kind of forgot. Yeah, pretty sure it's the thin spacers between the aluminum mount here and the servo, the ears here, okay? So just bear that in mind. You'll have to sort of test it yourself. The manual doesn't tell you which spacers to use. The electronics installation in the back, for me at least, was very tight. I use a Novak Pulse speed control and a Spectrum SR301 receiver. The receiver is a moderate size. The Pulse is relatively large as far as speed controls go. And I had originally, well, just getting these two to fit is difficult but possible. You really have to mount the receiver as far off to the side as you can over here, and that'll give you just enough space to sort of slot this in, but it is hard. I had originally mounted the speed control in a way so that the port here for this sensor harness was facing the rear of the chassis, And what ended up happening was when I went out for my first practice laps, I'd land a jump and I'd lose throttle for like 5 seconds. And what I eventually figured out was when you mount it with this port facing the rear, the sensor cable is bent in such a way so that when you land a jump and this jiggles around, it jiggles around just enough to reset the speed control. And then it has to go through its initialization phase, and then you get throttle back. So after I figured it out, I just turned this around, and now it's fine. I can jostle it around, and it doesn't reset the speed control. So just bear that in mind. If you can't mount it here based on where your sensor wire is and your power wires are, try to mount it either facing the front or the center of the chassis if you can. Now this did create a problem for me because the power capacitor that comes with the Pulse, I had originally had it mounted here with Velcro. But since it's on this side now, oops, sorry, it's not, the wires are not quite long enough to fit into this little bay here. And, you know, maybe I can put it here or something, but that's kind of bulky or sloppy. So this is basically floating around. Not a big deal. I haven't had any issues with it, you know, causing problems during running. But just to point out, you know, electronics installation here is much, much tighter than in the B4. Okay, so as far as running the chassis goes, overall I have to say I'm very, very pleased with this buggy. Where do I start? So you'll probably hear, if you watch reviews or read reviews on the B5, probably the most common things that you'll hear about it relative to the B4 is that it turns better and it jumps better. But those are very generic comments. I would say that it's true. This does turn better and it does jump better. But I'm going to try to give you maybe a few examples or try to explain a little more as to how I feel it turns better and jumps better. So my B4, this guy right here, this is the B4.1 factory team with the standard bore version 2 shocks. Okay, I don't have big bore shocks on this. That buggy, I drove it for about 2 years, and I've made some changes to the setup that are not the factory or stock setup, but it's largely a factory setup. And it's a good buggy, but what I found was that in driving the B4, for me at least, I had to use my driving to compensate for a lack of mid-corner steering. Okay, so if I was going into a hairpin, I had to use the brakes to rotate the car. If I was going into a wide sweeper, a high-speed sweeper, the car would tend to push mid-corner, and so I'd have to get off the throttle a bit and get back on the throttle to try to kick the back end out to negotiate that sweeper. With the B5, on a hairpin turn, I could just hit the brakes, turn in, the car just whips around the hairpin. It doesn't slide, it just handles around the turn like it's on rails, and I can shoot right back out. High-speed sweepers, no problem. You know, the car stays planted pretty much no matter what kind of corner I'm negotiating, at least as far as, you know, what I've tried so far. Very planted car, very direct, very solid feel. The B4 tends to be a little more vague in terms of the handling. If you want mid-corner steering on a B4, you end up setting it up in a way so that the rear end slides around more. On this, the rear end stays planted, even though you have plenty of steering. So that's very nice to have. And this is in part why I feel like I don't really need to get a mid-motor chassis, because at least relative to the B4 that I'm used to driving, this has so much more steering that I don't feel the need for mid-motor. But that's my own personal taste, okay? Excellent steering characteristics. I haven't really found anything too wrong with it. I could drive it a lot harder based on how it steers and jumps. I don't have to worry so much about, you know, landing every jump perfectly and making sure I'm squared up coming out of turns before gunning on the throttle. You know, if you ever have to hesitate for a moment because you're not confident that you have the rear traction you need to start, you know, to get on the throttle, then you're losing time. And with the B4, as great of a buggy as it is, there's less margin for error. So on this, I could, you know, land certain jumps and get on the throttle a lot faster because I knew that I wouldn't have to worry about bottoming out or, landing at an off angle and having to wait a while for the suspension to settle. This kind of takes it very nicely. So as a good example, on the current layout that I run on, there's a relatively large double on the far right side of the track, and the back side of that jump lands into a sweeper, or really a sharp right-hander that goes to a long front straight, into a sweeper, into a hairpin. So this backside here, the face of the jump, of the first jump on the double, is kind of angled, so it's actually a very tricky jump to negotiate. It's easy to overshoot it, and a lot of people do that to stay on the safe side, because if you try to cut on the inside, you risk hitting the pipe or rolling over or crashing or whatever. I did get to a point where I was able to negotiate that jump pretty well with the B4, but it took a lot of practice. But if I got it wrong, if I landed a little wide, for example, because the B4 does not have very good mid-corner steering, if I land wide, then I got to turn sharper to get onto the straight. And I would lose a lot more time as a result. And I didn't have as much confidence that I'd have rear traction, so I couldn't really push the car if I landed wide to really get going again. So I lose even more time. With the B5, it was a lot easier to really take pretty much any line that I wanted off of that jump. I could cut on the inside and have, pretty good confidence that I was going where I wanted to put the car, because the steering is more direct. It's not as vague, so I don't have some basic idea of where the car is going. I know where it's going to go. If I happen to jump wide, I can get on the throttle earlier, because I can compensate for that by turning more sharply, more quickly, and getting on the throttle quicker. So overall, I'm very happy with this. Again, you can really focus on driving harder and faster with less effort, which is really good if you know what you're doing. If you're a beginner, as much as I hate to say it, you should really start with a B4. Although as torturous as it will be, although I hate to use the term, you will learn how to drive, and you will really learn to appreciate how good this buggy really is. If you're getting into the hobby just now and you're getting a B5, you won't have the same level of appreciation of how wonderful this chassis is to drive. I really, really like this buggy. So the suspension geometry, the stock setup and everything for camber and caster and Ackerman and everything, it's actually very similar to the B4. So the only things that I can think of that might differentiate, that might make this jump better and land better than the B4 are the shocks. These are big bore shocks. Those are standard bore shocks. So these are a bit more plush. The car itself is a little meatier, so maybe there's a little bit more weight up front that's helping with the handling characteristics. The rear shock angle might be a little different. I'll have to go back and check that. But if you have a gull-wing arm like this, I would expect that to give you a little bit more side bite under cornering loads. So maybe that helps keep the rear end planted when you're pushing in a corner. Actually, let me check the B4. I'm pretty sure the B4 has, B4 has straight arms in the back, or at least where the bottom of the shock mounts, it's on the straight portion of the arm, even though the arm itself is a gull-wing arm. If you look on the B5, right, the shock mounts on the gull-wing part. So what that means is that this angle here on a cornering load, this part of the arm is pushing against the shock as opposed to this part of the arm. And when this part of the arm is angled further up on a cornering load, that arm has a more direct input into the shock. So it's almost as if the shock is a little softer under a cornering load. It would be very similar, for example, to taking the shock and putting it at a more laid down angle. Okay? At least that's what I would figure would happen if you use a gull-wing arm in that way. So let's see. What else do I have to say about this? The race itself went very well. I was going to make a video of it, but I think my camera ran out of batteries or something. It only recorded the first minute. but I ended up qualifying 6th out of, I think it was 39 drivers for 17.5 buggy. So I was in the A main. It was a little difficult to put in a clean run during qualifiers, but nevertheless, you know, I was very happy with the pace. I knew what the car could do. I ended up finishing 2nd in the A main, even though I got taken out on the first lap. So at the beginning of the first lap, I actually ended up in last place and had to work my way all the way up through 2nd. I made a few bobbles along the way. That was my fault. But overall, I found it much easier to really push this car and work my way through the pack to get back up to the front of the field. So I really, really like this buggy. I'm very happy with it. If you're looking at a new 2-wheel drive buggy, it's really hard to go wrong with this. It's $240. You know, it's not $500 or $450 like the Kyosho RB6. And it's a great design. Parts are nice and chunky. I haven't broken anything. I had a few crashes, nothing too serious, but I didn't break anything, at least not yet. And very happy with it. I don't have, I can't say enough good things about it. So right now, this is all I can think of as far as what to say. But if you have any questions, please, you know, feel free to post comments. And thanks for watching.